Welcome, everyone. My name is Neha Basnet. I am a postdoctoral researcher in Research in Education Department, Amsterdam UMC. And today I'm going to talk about timeline mapping exercise. It's a methodology-based paper that me and my co-authors, Anouk Waters and Rasmi Kusurkar, we wrote together. It hasn't been published yet. We are planning to send it to the journals for publication. So any kind of feedback or suggestions are welcome at the end of the presentation. Yeah, and I would also like to thank Learn for providing this opportunity to present the paper. So what exactly is a timeline mapping exercise? Before that, I would like to discuss a little bit of the outline of the presentation. So I will talk about what is timeline mapping and the different type of timeline mapping exercise that the researchers can do and how to conduct it. It's also necessary for the researchers to learn about timeline mapping. At the same time, they should be able to communicate that really well to the participants, how they can participate in the research methodology. And the last will be how to analyze the data that the researchers collect from the timeline mapping exercise. Okay, so what is timeline mapping exercise? It is a method, it is a research technique to collect the data. And the timeline mapping exercise has been used very frequently in life trajectory studies, where researchers would like to understand how an individual lives have been transitioned from one stage to the other. For example, it could be transition from a basic school to higher education, or from higher education to work. So there are different kind of transitions that an individual have. And it is not only limited to transition from education, it could be also how the individual behavior or the changes that takes place when, for example, the two interventions we have just observed or listened to. So we can also look into how the behaviors in an individual's changes from the time that intervention happens until the end of intervention. So it would be also interesting to look into that aspect of individuals. Yes. So what timeline mapping does is it provides a useful data, enriched data. It helps us to understand the richness of the journey of an individual, how do they transition, what kind of patterns exist, and why do they make certain kind of decisions in their life, or why do they make certain kind of choices. So it helps us to understand those questions, and it also helps us to look into the wider relationship between the socio-economic culture context in which those kind of decisions takes place. So timeline mapping could be diverse forms, like it could be both artistic and non-artistic, and can be conducted in a different style or different manner. So I'm gonna show you the different kind of timeline exercise that has been conducted, which I myself conducted in my PhD research. So what I did was in my PhD research, I asked the participants, first of all, I actually showed them what timeline mapping is and how it could be conducted. I explained to them, and I will also explain later in the presentation how it can be conducted. So this is one form of timeline mapping exercise, which is also known as horizontal timeline mapping exercise, meaning the research participant, they choose to just provide the information and kind of sketch it in between the paper where they have just fill up their information. So this sort of timeline mapping where the participant provides information in a horizontal manner is called horizontal timeline mapping exercise. The second one is like list-like. It's a vertical form of timeline mapping exercise, or where they provide information in a list format. So they will just list out their information. Here in my research, what I tried to do was I try to ask them to take me through their life story. So starting from birth, what happened, what kind of events do they recall, everything until the time of the interview. So they provided the age and information about the parents and so on and so forth, but in a list format. So this kind of timeline mapping is called list-like timeline mapping. And then there is another kind of timeline mapping where the researchers themselves could design it and ask the participant to fill out information that they want to gather. Of course, all the timeline mapping, it varies because researchers have different aims and objectives and research questions, right? So based on that, you can design different kind of timelines. So here the researcher asks the participant to fill out in a certain design timeline where you could see there are different emotions. So it is more artistic timeline mapping exercise. And there are also informations about what they did or what kind of events happened in between. So in all of this timeline mapping exercise, sorry, I wanted to go back. So in all of these three timeline mapping samples that I have showed you, there is one common theme, and that is the timelines. So the numbers are very important. That's why the name comes from timeline mapping exercise. So it is really important to show the participants that it has to be mentioned, and they have to like sort of try to figure out like what happened, if not exact time, but approximately when it happens and what kind of events do they recall. So that is very important. So how to conduct this kind of timeline mapping exercise? So timeline mapping are really based on personal narratives and stories told by the participant who participate in such kind of research. So it's very the data that you collect are subjective experiences of the participants or the storytellers. And to make it easier for the researchers, me and together with my co-authors, we came up with 5 steps to help the researchers how they can adopt and how they can also prepare the research participants to conduct the timeline mapping exercise. So the first step is to explain, of course, the research aim, objectives, and intention of the research to the participants. It's very important, and so that they could also prepare themselves what is expected from them, and how they can also sort of structure their stories. Not directly influencing the answers to the questions, but still like they could, kind of sort of prepare themselves what is expected to them and what they have to communicate. Then
the second step. They had 3 more minutes.
Okay, so then the second step of for the researchers to explain the timeline mapping exercise. It's possible to show them different styles of timeline mapping. That's what I have done in my research as well. But also you can do some mock interviews before you go for real interviews, and then try to show those samples. Then, the steps are to conform it and provide the necessary materials to the participants, which is needed to conduct such kind of research. But you can also be creative. If you do not want to use paper-based and in-person interviews, then you could also use electronic version of timeline mapping exercise and share it with the participants. So that is also possible. And the important aspect of using timeline mapping and conducting interviews is try to keep the instructions very minimal, because then it will help to get more richer data, and it will not sort of guide the participant what to say in the research settings. And the last thing is, yes, try to ask the participants when the recorder is off, and try to have more interaction so that you can get more interviews. Like in the earlier presentations, like whenever the recorder is on or video is on, there is always this, kind of nervousness and attention towards what has been recording, or whether you are being observed or not, then how you have to communicate your stories. So it really affects that. Then the final step is to analyze the data that has been collected. So these are, we also come up with the 6 steps how a researcher could analyze the data that has been collected from timeline mapping exercise. So it's very important to first, before going into the interviews or recordings, it is important to look into the mapping exercise that has been done together with the research participants and try to familiarize oneself with what has been said and how it has been written or provided information, what you can see actually on the timeline mapping exercise. Then try to come up with identify themes and patterns. In my research, I try to look into the patterns of education to work transitions. So it also depends on the kind of questions or research aims that you have. May not be the patterns, maybe identifying themes on different kind of issues that exist. And then try to compare and contrast those themes in different timelines that you have collected. And also the events, live events influencing those stages, or why they took certain decisions at that point. So that is also important, or significant moments, for example, divorce of the parents, or death in the family. It could be anything influencing that certain moment or decision making. And reviewing and finalizing and presenting the story. So that should be the last step of the data analysis process.